Speaker, before we start, we really want to just readdress like some of the sensitivities we should keep in mind. Firstly, like around COVID has caused like quite a lot of the, and some of the recent racial tensions in the United States has seen an uptick in Asian violence and discrimination. And we should just try and be a little more sensitive, I think, when we're arguing this debate. So just before we really get into our arguments about like why we think that the myth of like the positive Asian stereotype brings more harm than it brings help. Let's just define a few things. One, what this standard is for racism. What the Asian like stereotype is. It's kind of it's this sort of it's this belief that like people in the Asian diaspora are often seen as harder workers. They're often more economically successful than some other stereotypes. Some other racial groups. And that they're often like follow like particular lines, or like they're seen as sexually submissive. They're also seen as submissive in society. The second one is like in terms of instead of racism itself. And what discrimination can look like. That can look like discrimination from like job opportunities, discrimination like in terms of like different human interactions and discrimination by the government. Let's crack onto our arguments. The way that we'll prove that discrimination is that the stereotypical Asian diaspora is what characterization is really harmful is firstly we're looking at on the way that how the stereotype has not benefited Asians at all. Second one is like how this myth prevents structural change in the system. The third is how the principle like is an abhorrent stereotype in itself. So in the first argument, like why this stereotype itself has not protected Asians from discrimination in the past and will not protect discrimination in the future. We will characterize this argument as we will prove that this stereotype that the Asian diaspora faces offers no real protections from either the government or from their society itself. So let's look up the mechanisms to prove this is like one, in the past, let's see how the Asian diaspora has been used against them. So the stereotype has been used against them. One, the White Australia policy in the Australian context was deliberately targeted against Asians to stop Asian immigration early in the 20th century and to bring in European immigrants, but like it was very specifically targeted against the Asian group. So the second one is like in Japanese internment in World War II, there was a very fervent belief that the Japanese citizens of America should be locked up because they could all be potential spies, despite overwhelming evidence this was unlikely to be the case. Third one was Chinatown, like what Chinatown actually is. Like we often see like many different Western nations have a Chinatown. These were actually created like firstly because they were pushing Chinese immigrants from those nations into specific suburbs, which are usually ghettos. So Chinatown might now be like a fine, nice place to go and get like a meal, but like it's not actually, it was never set up with like positive ideas in mind. It was used as a way of just shoveling them out of the way, shoveling these groups out of the way. And also another way of just like how also denied to access to public services. So for example, California back in like the 19th century denied Chinese immigrants access to public schools. Fourth, One Nation, Pauline Hanson has built her entire legacy in the Senate out of like deliberately targeting the threat of Vietnamese immigration. So there very clearly exists like this way that the user stereotype has been used in the past to discriminate. And five is like the minority belief, this belief that they are submissive. So like one, this leads to underrepresentation in leadership roles and corporate roles, particularly in Western nations. Second one is like sexist connotations where they see Asian women tend to be more submissive to their husbands. So therefore they would make better wives. Look at boomers with Asian wives on Facebook for more information. The third one is like the history of colonialism itself. So like, for example, like China for itself, like they were like hit massively with the opium wars, like injecting opium, their country being carved up like a cake by the different Western European powers. And like in India, we've seen like the chattel slavery through the British government. There's never really been talk or like emphasis on reparations from these groups. So the reason why we're pointing all these out is that this diaspora has offered no protections in the past against these specific examples. So the second argument is like why the Asian myth, let's just call it that, prevents the structural change that should be needed. So like the narrative that surrounds like Asian societies is not actually constructive to benefiting the Asian communities in diaspora that exist. One, because because how it entrenches the beliefs in white supremacy, and how it like pits Asian communities versus like the other minority communities. The way that it entrenches white superiority is because we'll just look at inter-minority violence just as proving like how this myth prevents structural change. One is like the Asian demographic itself is seen as like being better, which pits themselves against like others. The way that it pits at others is like, the belief is like, oh yeah, we're harder working compared to like maybe like the stereotype that exists in American society where black societies are often seen as being like more lazy, when this is a myth that is being perpetuated by like often more the real racist elements, such as like the Ku Klux Klan, who often use Japan as a model society because they're like, oh yeah, Japan's an ethno state. Look how great Japan is. And they say like, why can't black people work like with Asian people? This is what is said by certain like bad faith actors. In terms of like there is like this self-belief, in terms of the inter-minority advance, there is actually like this self-belief that does come sometimes that can arise from this narrative that like, oh, we're actually better than them because we've operated better on we're industrious people, they're not, they should be like us, which fuels inter-minority violence from the side of like Asians towards other communities. But from the other side, it's like that resentment from that belief notion of superiority, which can then cause like deliberate violence against Asians as a result of this, as we have kind of seen that it has been breaking out a bit from like African-American communities and Asian communities in the United States. The impact of this is just results in like one, just deaths. There's a lot of violence, physical harm that actually comes from this. The second one is like there's a poor minority conscious, like this breaks up class collective consciousness between different minority groups, which helps prevent unionizing against white supremacy itself. And like stops the push and cause for advancement of rights of Asians. Second, another point is just poor activism itself. Asians themselves, Asian communities might feel discriminated in like unis such as like Harvard against affirmative action for African Americans, when it'd be better for them to target the fact that like 50% of spots in these prestigious universities are held for legacy admissions, which is like favoring like overwhelmingly rich white people. One, this does like fracture from progressives because you have people like trying to go mega woke, like, oh, Asians are actually white people because they are better off in the economic circumstances, whereas other ones go like, no, that's kind of not right because of like colonialism. It just fractures the progressive movement, does not help the Asian community. Third main argument is why this is principally a horror of a stereotype. People should be free to define themselves, free from what society pushes on them. They should be able to come up with their own sense of self-identity. So saying like good things that might arise from this, like a positive Asian stereotype, like they're hard workers or like they're really good at maths, would still constrain like the choice and the ability for them to self-identify, because it does push people into like these narrow boxes, and which is a dehumanizing thing. Even if you are seen as more a positive second-class citizen, you're still being looked as a second-class citizen by the status quo. The second one is still discriminatory, even if it's not immediately obvious, because it is demanding people and it is pushing people to follow like these different careers and progressions, and they should be free to explore the life and pursue liberty, happiness. The impact of this is like, we think it's this legitimizes the self-identity that should exist for Asian people, that allows them to fit in normally with society. So we believe that like any potential benefits that might come from the stereotype are far, far outweighed by the negatives it portrays on these communities. So proud to affirm.
I think the affirmative team doesn't know what Asian minorities want in Western countries, which basically means that when they're trying to tell you, oh, we want to eliminate stereotypes, firstly, we think stereotypes is not possible to be eliminated in the society. But secondly, when they're giving you some mechanism on talking about, oh, like Chinatown is being as a way of excluding minorities in the society, several responses here. Firstly, being submissive doesn't mean that this is actually filling into the characteristic of being a model or like a minority model in the society, which is directly against what this topic should be talked about. But secondly, we think Chinatown is just like exists independently without this narrative, which basically means that if this is being a form of exclusion, it exists without this narrative being pushed into the society. Which means that their first argument just become totally irrelevant into this debate. The second thing they're trying to bring up is that there is going to be increasing resentment between different minority groups. That is to say, being a model or like being a minority model, this kind of narrative is going to be telling to Black people and saying that, oh, this is the way that you should behave, and increasing resentment between minority groups. I don't think this is going to be true. Firstly, like society rewarding people being hardworking, society rewarding people who contribute or like having higher economic income compared to others, which basically means that even if you don't have the norm of like being a model minority, this kind of rewarding, this kind of like social matrix is going to exist under both sides. We don't think this kind of thing is definitely going to be caused by like the simple narrative of model minority minority. But secondly, we think minorities are more likely going to be friendly towards each other. That is to say, under best case scenario, saying that there's going to increase in misunderstanding between both minorities groups. We don't think this is going to be that hardship where like Chinese people to bonding with African people in terms like they both feel being excluded from the Western society. We think how this kind of mutual understanding is going to be a way more like easier way or efficient way for them to bond friendship. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. Firstly, what is the benefits on under our side, which is basically related to how this is going to lessen discrimination. And secondly, why this kind of on this narrative is going to occur more tangible benefits on Asian Americans. I think what Asian Americans want, or like Asian minorities want in Western society is several things. Firstly, the reason why they immigrate to a Western world is because of, first of all, probably like political prosecution and they want to have a safer place. But most of all, secondly, most of the people actually immigrate because they want to pursue a higher economic income, which basically means that they want to change their social status. That is to say, for example, if you see like American Dream, that just like persuade a lot of Asian Americans or to become like the first immigrant in America. I'm going to talk about why this is going to lessen the discrimination. Notice panel, the narrative is always going to exist around minorities in the society. That is to say, if you eliminate the narrative of being a model minority, there are more likely going to be some like bad narrative against the minorities. The reason why this is going to be true is because first of all, it's just empirically true. Seeing from all the historical examples, there are so many judgment towards people. But secondly, we think people just intrinsically love judge others based on their traits. That is to say, you're more likely going to judging, oh, like what kind of like dresses a female should wear. And we think those kind of judgment is also going to appear on minorities as well. We think because of those kind of things, narrative is going to exist in our society. So what are the narratives that is going to exist except the narrative on model minority? We think those narratives are more likely going to be bad and negative, targeting at specific minorities. That is to say, if you see minorities, Asian minorities being described as being a nerdy, and secondly, if you've seen that those people are going to be described as like taking away local people's jobs, we think those are the narratives that make those people being discriminated against in the society, feeling excluded in the society. We think those narratives is going to exist under both sides. We think under our side, at least you have a counter narrative to make people feeling, or like at least feel the best part of Asian Americans and providing more like inclusiveness to them. The second part here I'm going to talk about is why this model minority, this narrative is going to, tackle down this like bad narrative exists in the society. The first reason why this is going to be true is because we think it just amplifies like the kindness part of the individual. That is to say, instead of saying an Asian American as being a nerdy, you're more likely going to see them as being hardworking. We think it's more likely going to have a better impression for people in terms of people like in the society with value and individuals value. That is to say, if I want to make friends with you, I need to testify whether you're a good person or not. Simply like if you're comparing those two characteristics, being a nerdy is just not a reason why I'm not going to be friends with if you're a really hardworking person and I can learn something from you. Which basically when you weigh over those kind of characteristics, it opens up the opportunity for people to get interactions with those Asian minorities in the very first place. We think those interactions also like further diminish the discrimination in the society. That is to say, if you have like first a conversation, you start talking to Asian Americans, you're more likely going to understand how their cultural background plays a role in your life. You're more likely going to understand them, which is still creating discrimination as a whole. But we see this just going to bring several tangible outcomes. Firstly, you see, if you compare the incarceration rate or like racial profiling, targeting us like, for example, Black people versus Asian Americans, we think it's more likely going to be Asian Americans less likely going to suffer from racial profiling as a whole. That is to say, this is how this narrative is going to change people's perception, which means that in the end of the result, you don't really get those people suffering in the criminal justice system as a whole. But secondly, it also looks at decreasing discrimination in terms of, for example, when you're being like funding housing, like that is, you can see, for example, Asian Americans first live in America, just like being banned from living in overcrowding places, but now they're actually going to be allowed to do so because people change the perception as a whole and people being more friendly towards them. We think those things are extremely important in terms of like when you're being an immigrant into like new places in new environment, those kind of inclusiveness that providing to you, those kind of like friendliness and kindness provide to you makes you have the incentive to insist and living in those countries. You see the report like 80% of international students suffer from like huge mental pressure. We think those kind of things more likely coming from exclusiveness existing in the society. We want to diminish them. The second thing I'm going to talk about here is why increasing like better representation. Firstly, it's just like when you're talking about like, for example, finding employment, you see Asian like female Asian Americans more likely going to have lower income gaps compared to any other races in the society. The reason why this is true is because when your characteristics is being prescribed as persistence and hardworking, you're more likely going to get jobs comparing to other minorities in the society, or like even comparing to the majority in the society. I think because those are the things that like employer actually pays attention the most. That is to say, how much value they can contribute to the company. We think in this case, you give more like opportunities for Asian Americans and get represented in like employment field. But secondly, if you look at university administration process, you're more likely going to hire like more like past administration towards Asian minorities. The reason why this is true is because we think those kind of things, like this kind of impression makes people feel, oh, like they're going to have really good scores. And that's the reason why like our university want those people and we want those kind of diversity, which means that when we're selecting different minorities, we're not even comparing to majority, we're more likely going to prioritize those Asian Americans in this case, which basically means that at the end of the day, firstly, you get increasing representation on our side, but secondly, a maximum amount of benefits to the individual, what actually minorities want. And certainly, we think it actually performs a really positive cycle. That is to say, if you have a senior that is going to represent you and more likely going to give you a really supportive system living in Western countries, we think those kind of things are extremely important for minorities living in Western world. For all those reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
The reason why none of those harms were actually counted for anything in this debate is because their burden was not to prove that the stereotype in absentia of other pre-existing forms of racism against Asians was somehow better for them than if this positive stereotype had not existed. Their burden was to clearly prove that in the context of overwhelming racism against Asians, that this particular stereotype's addition to that world made it better instead of worse. And they conclusively failed because they failed to prove that this is actually how their model functions. Let's address their case in a number of ways, right? The first thing we want to talk about is what do Asians actually want? The second idea is on the idea of contact theory and how this makes people more tolerant. And finally, I guess on, what the actual metrics of this debate are. First thing to address in regards to what Asians want is that if we believe that these people are in fact motivated by running away from political violence and also increased economic prospects, the first thing to ask is who is actually benefiting from this stereotype, which is something that the negative team never actually does in this debate. Who are the demographics that do benefit from this model minority? Well, it's certainly not people who do not fit that myth. And that alone immediately eliminates the vast majority of the Asian diaspora from benefiting from this in this instance, right? Because of what the stereotype entails. Will tells you that the stereotype entails these people are likely to be, professionals, people who are, upper class because of the job they got, because they are hardworking, because they are seen to, have achieved success in this new life. If you do not achieve success for the reasons that you are subject to racism by the outside environment, something which still exists under the status quo, right? That means that you do not ever get to see any of the benefits from this myth, because at no point do they actually explain how those benefits could possibly eventuate to the people who are living in ghettos because they were targeted by racist violence and discrimination, because of the fact that they immigrated from these areas seeking a better life, but did not come with qualifications that were accepted by the white community. Deeply unclear as to how this in any way positively affected those people. And because of that, their benefits in this debate are pathetically small. The second thing then to ask is, is if this actually does, produce commonalities, which would then lead to people being seen as, model minorities. And we see that this is obviously not true, right? The issue is that, as I flagged earlier, you have to be considered good only if you fit this stereotype. And this is principally wrong for the reason that Will gives you, insofar as we do not think people's respect should be conditional upon obeying an incredibly arbitrary and insulting stereotype which reduces Asians to nothing more than squinty eyes and a proficiency at math. That is deeply principally insulting and something we would never stand behind as a benefit in this debate of all the fucking things. But also, right, additionally, we should consider the reasons why these people would still be likely to be racist. Firstly, because there are other things that can change their opinion on you at any time. People who are professionals are still going to be targeted impacted by things like coronavirus attacks. I am like a relatively well-off university student, and this time last year, I was still clearing fucking train roads by clearing my throat on the train with a mask on, right? For Christ's sakes, this is kind of a cheap shot, but like, last year you were telling anecdotes about how you were being talked down to at the phone repair shop because someone thought you were Chinese instead of Korean and thought you were responsible for bringing COVID into the country. Like, there is no way in which these people will not simply abandon the model minority, even if you do actually fit their beliefs, because racism is still a thing in the status quo. They have to defend the world in the status quo because that is the one with the model minority myth. And we claim to you at will for a large number of reasons as to why the model minority myth never actually insulates you from this particular brand of racism. This was never something they responded to. They cannot claim the benefit that all of a sudden people are less racist because of this, when in reality, we tell you quite clearly that there are in fact comparative harms to this racism, to this particular stereotype being a thing. Why do these comparative harms eventuate, right? The first thing to say is that this is used as a battering ram to fracture solidarity with other ethnic groups like the Black community, meaning that instead of being able to band together and work against the pillars of white supremacy on a massive collective level with the combined manpower of every single minority within the group, that within the country they work for, right? Instead, they are forced to sort of straggle along on their own, separated from the other ethnic groups by tension that is induced when you are preferenced over every one of them. Because not only does that paint you as a traitor to the cause of non-white individuals by people from, you know, the Black community, which is why you see such a high rate of like ethnic violence from Black communities against Asian people, right? But also you yourself internalize that norm and in turn become racist yourself, because you believe, as the negative team apparently quite clearly does when they bring up the point about hard work, that because you are the hardworking minority, no other minority can be the hardworking minority. Clearly, these are the people who are dole bludgers. Clearly, these are the people who are skiving off the goodwill of the state. That was something which made you not only a worse person in principle for being fucking racist, right? But also it prevented your ability from unionizing with these people to actually tackle the people who are putting the racism in place and therefore affecting significantly greater change to benefit the entirety of the diaspora in the long term. Incredibly short-term, incredibly insulting analysis from the negative team in this department. Additionally, right, we also tell you that not only does it prevent unionization to actually identify and to actually solve problems where they occur, but it also prevents people from being able to accurately identify that these problems even exist. Because the stereotype of these Asian communities is just that they are all made up of successful people who are like doctors and engineers and like MIT lecturers or whatever, right? Instead, it ignores the overwhelming, you know, people who do live in poverty, who do live in ghettos, who do not benefit from the model minority myth and are instead forced to rely on the goodwill of people who are predisposed to be racist to them because they have a slightly different shade of melanin in their skin. This was something that, by my demographic analysis in the first point, was very likely to be the vast majority of Asian Americans and Asian people of any diaspora, really. And this, therefore, indicated that, you know, that by and large, their benefit could not possibly to apply to these people. And instead, the harm of these people being erased, the harm of these people never getting their problems heard from either the government, who is not only disinclined to believe these people because they are racist, but also because they believe that Asians just don't suffer any problems because they just work their way out of it, but also amongst people who would otherwise have a great stake in helping you get out of those problems because they don't think you are actually oppressed. And these were all massive, massive harms to the movement at large that ultimately crippled its ability to make long-term progress against white nationalism, something which was the greatest, most existential harm against it in this debate, especially in the time of coronavirus. The final thing to talk about is the actual metrics in this debate. And let us explain to you why their point about how other people have it bad is just running away from their burden. The topic in this debate is to prove that the model minority myth has benefited Asian diasporas more than it has harmed them. The fact that Black people may have had it worse is not only something we should probably just not do, because comparing people's suffering is just kind of unproductive as a whole, but also it is not establishing that these people were not harmed. Clearly, these people did suffer a lot under colonialism. Clearly, these people did suffer a lot because of targeted racist violence. All of these things were harms which still occurred, which we proved to you at will this particular model minority myth could not insulate them from. And because of that, they failed to prove literally any benefits in this debate. Deeply pathetic how they run away from their burden at every turn and call us uncomparative. At the end of this, what did we actually achieve, right? The first thing we gave you was a list of reasons as to why this did not prevent discrimination. We gave you not only empirical reasons, but also proof that in the vast majority of cases, the people who are going to benefit from this myth were those who are already insulated by a wealth of other factors, such as privilege, such as qualifications, such as already holding an esteemed job. The second thing we told you was that this prevented structural change against the very forces that were looking to exterminate the Asian American diaspora, because it prevented them from finding unity with other ethnic groups as due to its nature as a tool of white supremacy. And we also told you it meant that these people's problems were never taken seriously. And that ultimately meant that there was such a massive, catastrophic harm that this caused to the Asian diaspora that unless they somehow want to prove like the fucking Whitey's rabbit out of his hat at second negative, deeply unclear how they can do anything in this debate.
Panel, let's be very clear about burdens in this debate. It obviously was not our burden to prove that the model minority myth protected Asian diaspora from things like the White Australia policy and things like internment camps, because this was something that developed in context after those policies were put in place. What we told you at Jenny, to little response there from that second speaker, is that this was a better narrative for Asian diaspora than the very racist narratives that they would be forced to live with, the kind of narratives that allowed policies like the White Australia policy in the first place to exist. We explained why this, even if it is an overcorrection, was necessary and how that led to tangible change. They might be very assertive, but that doesn't mean that you should dismiss everything that Jenny told you at first. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, what would other narratives would exist? Secondly, what are the impacts on discrimination? And finally, how does this impact structural change? Firstly, it is worth noting that this motion is historically phrased, which means that we need to compare whether we would have got to this point where, like, obviously we're not denying that discrimination exists. There is like lots of awful discrimination, but whether the world would be better if we still just like stuck with the negative stereotypes that allowed for those awful policies to exist in the first place, or whether the minority myth was helpful. Because we told you at Jenny, to no response, that the kinds of narratives that existed around Asian diaspora were things like they are bringing opium and drugs, they are here to steal gold in the gold rush, they are communists, they are like traitors to our country, and those were incredibly pervasive myths. We thought that it was better, even if it was still regrettable, to have a narrative that at least associated you with positive characteristics, desirable characteristics, things that meant that you would be a good member of the community. They give you no reason to believe, like they have just not given you one in substantive, to believe that any of these racist stereotypes to exist that existed like at the point where this like new norm started to exist would have gone away. And Jenny tells you that they likely wouldn't, by pointing out that lots of like other minority communities who haven't benefited from something like the model minority community still have like really strong elements of those initial discriminations that exist today. That looks like people continuing to talk about how African American men are a threat to young women and your wives, and they're going to be incredibly violent against you. Like obviously like some discrimination still exists, but we thought that like largely people no longer thought that the majority of Asian diaspora were like here to steal your job, or were communists, or like anti-Australian in any of these ways. There were 2 impacts here. Firstly, their principle just largely fell out of this debate because, yes, we agreed with them that it was principally regrettable that there were like groups of diaspora and minorities that were expected and like that were bound by the way that society perceived them. But at the point that they don't prove that they also don't have that and that it's just not a more negative way of society perceiving them, there wasn't a principal difference in this debate. Secondly, and it moves on to our second theme on the bearing of discrimination in total. Firstly, as I flagged in my intro, most of their analysis here at first in particular was like, it obviously hasn't protected people, internment camps existed, the White Australia policy existed. Those kinds of things are obviously not what we're talking about because like there just wasn't a model minority myth or like the idea of a model minority, like Asian being a model minority when internment camps were around. Like obviously you wouldn't be think that these people are like particularly great when you're putting them in internment camps or specifically making policy to keep them out of your country. But secondly, importantly, what Jenny told you is that even to the extent that this might have been an overcorrection, that was incredibly important because when you were countering the context that they set up to you, where you have all of these incredibly negative perceptions, it probably wasn't ever going to be enough to say like, oh yeah, like Asian people are just like kind of fine, like there's nothing particularly admirable about them, because then you would only ever focus on difference in a negative light. What the model minority myth did is that it meant that there was now a really positive light in terms of difference, because they don't prove how you ever stop perceiving minority groups as different. We thought at the point that you needed to perceive them as different in some way, it was good to perceive them as hardworking, as like incredibly like valuable members of society, rather than people who are doing active detriments to your society by being part of it, which is the counterfactual that they need to stand for in this debate. They then say that this will only help people who fit the bill. But I don't think that this is true. Even if it is true that it is more beneficial to like Asian diaspora who do like align with these stereotypes, it means that like generally people like can't tell what job you have when you are walking down the street. It means that like when like a police officer sees like a Chinese American person versus like seeing a black person on the street, they are just empirically less likely to racially profile them and to like engage in things like for police brutality against them. Obviously, it still exists because some police officers are incredibly racist, but by having a general positive association when you see Asian people in general, that was obviously much better than like seeing these people and thinking that they are inherently criminals or that they are inherently people who are really risky. And that trickled down to all people who fit within this diaspora group, even if they didn't necessarily like get the full extent of the benefits. And finally, they point that things like COVID still, like discrimination still exists. And like, we absolutely do not want to deny that this exists and this is awful, but it's unclear why the model minority myth really has that much of a bearing on this form of discrimination. Like, if we could prove that more discrimination existed, we think that we still got ahead without completely disproving it. And don't underestimate the impact of what Jenny told you. We told you that it was incredibly awful as an African-American being like constantly rejected from like rent assist, being able to rent in certain areas, being constantly at like fearing police, all of this like incredibly large scale of violence, that those were really, really important things to you as a person. And if this myth made it less likely that someone was going to reject you from a house and less likely that you were going to be assaulted on the street just for being who you are, we thought that that was a huge benefit that they couldn't just dismiss. Finally, let's look at the impact that this has on structural change, because I think that this is interesting material where they say that like, okay, this is a tool that is used by like white people to like push groups against each other. Firstly, I don't think that this only exists because of things like the model minority myth. And I think that the example here is if you look at something like the US, like African-American and Latinx communities are also pitted against each other in similar ways using other narratives like, well, African-Americans, you were here first. These are more recent immigrants. You need to be pitted against each other. They're stealing your jobs. They're coming for you. And that like, there is also like that kind of level of non-alignment in incentives and like interracial, into like group violence that does occur. So I don't think that they actually establish that this myth is like the absolute tipping point in that violence happening. But then secondly, they also don't like actually prove to you that any of the structural changes that they want to get are likely. Maybe it is true that you have a slightly more like unified group when you have like all of the like ethnic minorities within a group, even if you could achieve that in a country. There's unclear why that outweighs things like the white majority and outweighs like really deeply ingrained prejudices in the first place. Obviously, it sounds like great to have like a more unified movement, but they don't actually link that to any structural harms. And I think it is too late for them to do that. At third speaker. But finally, and like they talk a bit about how this is a tool that is used against other minorities. And like I know that this doesn't sound great in this debate when they talk about how like at times like the Asian community is being used like being given benefits to kind of shame like groups like the African American community. But specifically in the context of this debate, given that we are purely evaluating whether this is good or bad for the African American community, if the outcome of that was that you like put lots of like Asian diaspora into elite institutions, even if that was coming at the expense of groups like African Americans, for the context of this debate, it is still a benefit because it is probably like it has meant that you get large numbers of like that Asian diaspora in these elite institutions getting access to opportunities that they never would have got under their side of the house because like of this like kind of vast levels of discrimination and there being like no reason under their side of the house to prioritize giving like Asian diaspora better opportunities and better treatment. So at the end of this debate, we thought that we got less discrimination and that we also thought that they really needed to explain why the counter narratives to this would be better. We were incredibly proud to oppose.
First question that needs to be evaluated in this debate is side negative able to attribute a net benefit to this norm? And we say that they cannot. What do they tell us in terms of why this norm is useful to the Asian diaspora? They tell us this is a stereotype that helps Asians because it says that they are smart, well-educated, able to assimilate and integrate and so on. Therefore, that means they're more likely to get educational opportunities, more likely to get jobs, more likely to be treated better in general because you are good and therefore you will receive good treatment. And that instead, the comparative would be one where you assume that all Asian people are communists who like opium and want to steal your gold from the gold rush. The first response we would give to that is just to say, presumably the fact that the times have changed since then and progressivism has occurred means that it is not clear that that is the comparative that would exist in this debate. We'd argue the treatment of all minority groups has improved over time. So they cannot just say that the treatment of Asian Americans or Asians is better now than it was in the past as a reason to believe this norm has worked, because that is also true of the treatment of African Americans. But the second response we'd give is to point out that this norm is only beneficial to the small subset of people who fit the bill of the norm. And Michael's response is to say, no, well, like you generally associate it with everyone because you don't really know if someone has a good job or not, or you don't know about the expectations of the job. But that is wrong, right? Because when you have that expectation built up around them, and you assume that everyone from this group is successful because they are the model minority, when that expectation is deflated, as it is, for example, when you can see that someone is poor, because those things are often very visible. You can see what part of the country they live in. You can see the kind of school they go to, the car they drive, the clothes they wear. That is when you see them as having failed on a fundamental level that is far worse than for other minorities, right? Because they were meant to succeed. And this is something even progressive groups often buy into. They're like, oh, well, you know, Asians have Asian privilege because they're a model minority and they still failed. Like, what was wrong with these people? How could they not get it together? The third response we give to you, though, is that it's just not clear that that benefit that they identify would not occur even in the absence of this norm, right? Like the people who are rich, well-educated, and part of the professional management class obviously are more immunized from the effects of racism than people who are not. That is not something attributable specifically to this stereotype. That is just something that occurs to people of all minority groups who gain those particular types of privileges. But the fourth response we give to this claim is just that there are other reasons people will still be racist to these groups, right? Stuff like COVID-19, stuff like the fact that they're just different and so on. And Michael's only response is like, well, what does that have to do with the norm? It's proof the norm isn't insulating them from any of the harms you claim. What is the benefit this norm is providing? You are unable to attribute it. But the fifth response we give to you is that the genealogy of the norm is specifically ahistoric, right? The reason the norm was created was specifically in the 1960s. People like William Peterson wrote op-eds in the New York Times saying like, look, Asian success stories, they're doing really well. They're a model minority in order to try and fight back against civil rights movements and in order to try and break up minority movements fighting for the Civil Rights Act because they knew that would be a successful strategy. This isn't some like very modern innovation. It was a specific norm constructed in order to kill the hopes of movements that wanted better. But the last thing to say, even if none of that is true, is this norm invites other types of violence and racism against Asians that would not exist in the absence of the norm. For example, when you think everyone is very rich and well educated, that is when you get fears about like they're going to take our jobs and so on, or H-1B visas shouldn't be allowed, or they're going to buy up all the houses in Australia. It is unclear at the end of all of this that this norm is on net positive for Asian Americans. They do not provide what this overall benefit is. And considering that, they have to lose the debate on those grounds right there. But additionally, we point to additional reasons as to why this is true. All the reasons in Will and Jonah's speech about all of the historic oppression that Asian diaspora has faced are reasons to believe this norm has not been successful, right? Because you cannot point to examples of oppression that Asian diaspora has not faced that other minorities have, right? It is in most regards, very equal. But secondly, even if you believe that there is some net benefit attached to this norm, we win the debate by then explaining to you why the fact that still larger harms exist and racism does still exist and could have been solved but for this norm because it prevents structural change. And those were all the mechanisms we explained to you in Will's speech that received no response. For example, the stuff like inter-minority animosity, their only response to this is to say, well, that exists between other minority groups too. Like they tell Hispanic people, they tell African Americans that Hispanic people came later and don't deserve to be here as much. That is not a fucking thing, right? Like when was the last time you heard like Latino people and African Americans fighting over who came here first? There's a reason that the main form of animus between racial groups is ones between Asian American communities and other minority communities. And it's because of this norm. We explained to you, it looks like things like Asian Americans feeling superior and looking down on other groups, and that triggering violence from other minority groups. And that means things like people dying. It means things like preventing the collectivization of minority groups, keeping in mind that if you add up the populations of like all the African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanics in the US, that is 45% of the population. That group would have the lobbying capacity and the power to achieve actual change in fighting white supremacy rather than fighting against each other. And we give you examples of that. For example, lawsuits like fair admissions against Harvard University involve minority groups fighting over a small piece of the pie and affirmative action policies, when legacy admissions to those universities make up a far larger slice of the pie and are far more immoral and should be the target of activism from all of those minority groups. But instead, they're pitted against each other. That would not happen in the absence of this norm. Secondly, we point out that it papers over problems that people within these groups face, and they would otherwise get help. right? Because many Asian people do live in poverty in the West, but those problems are papered over. Governments don't feel the need to engage in urban redevelopment or responses to those particular types of problems because they're told it doesn't exist. All my Asians are like doctors and successful. But secondly, it means even people from those groups often feel like they cannot accept that help. Because they're a model minority, it would be shameful to need that help, and therefore they deny it from themselves, and that makes their lives far worse. But thirdly, we explain to you that this is just a narrative that white supremacists are able to use and say, well, America or Australia or Britain is the land of opportunities because Asian people are able to succeed and become doctors, so there are no problems. So there is no need for change. So we can just keep the same institutions that exist right now. There is no reason why any of that change needs to occur. And that means that even if you believe that this norm results in the exact set of benefits that side negative demand claims, like better job prospects and so on, weigh that up against all of the potential benefits you could get if you fight all of the racist and structural forces that we explained to you there is a huge incentive to do because victims of oppression would like to fight it. And we explained to you there is a huge capacity to do because put together all of those groups have an immense amount of the population and an immense capacity to engage in lobbying. They are only held back by this norm and we regret it deeply. But lastly, we explained to you on principle grounds that this norm is immoral, right? Even if it is positive things being said about people, those are things that are not true for the vast majority of people in that group. Those are things that restrict the humanity and the individuality of members of this group, that define them down to just one trait about themselves that is often not true and limit their capacity for self-identification. And more importantly, it is a norm that denies and erases all of the past injustices committed against this group, right? Because colonialism didn't matter, because slavery didn't matter, because the model minorities are still able to reach through. Why are you focusing on those things? Why are you so caught up in something that occurred in the last century when, you just need to be more like those other Asian Americans who are successful now? And that is immoral on a level that we think wins us this debate for the third time over. Incredibly proud to affirm.